Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Very good day. Molweni, goeiemorgen. Welcome to Life Matters, where we explore the journeys that shape us, the wellness to heal us, and the stories that inspire us. In today's parenting episodes, we're tackling a rather crucial aspect of child education as we shine a light on the very uncomfortable conversation, the talk that we often call the birds and the bees conversation. So today we unpack that specific conversation with little ones about the birds and the bees sex education. Joining me is a child educational psychologist, Nabila Gangat, who will guide us through the do's and don'ts of approaching this sensitive topic, from understanding our own values and beliefs to addressing common questions and concern. We'll absolutely explore it all. Now, Nabila Gangat is an experienced educational psychologist with a passion for supporting families and young children. Nabila has a special interest in working with families and young children who have emotional difficulties. Nabila also enjoys working with teenagers, adolescents, and young adults who have often some life difficulties. She works with these young adults in order to ensure that their full potential is achieved. She's also passionate about serving the Muslim community, which has a massive need for mental services. So let's dive into this world of sex education for children and learn how to have that open and honest conversation with our little ones. Thank you so much for joining us, Nabila. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to the show.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's really, really good to be here with you, Khawa.
So nice to see that we're connecting with you at your offices. Alhamdulillah, I'm sure you have a busy day ahead, but I know that you're passionate about this. So let's get into it. What would you say are some reasons why it's essential to discuss sex education with little ones? How does it also impact their development when they are educated about it? And what is the most critical aspect of talking to kids about sex, and why is it so important?
So I'll unpack that question. I think there are many facets of why I'm, number one, very passionate about this topic. And I do advocate that Muslim families particularly do have these discussions within their home. The main reason that I have become so aware of this is through my work. When I speak to young kids, when they have issues, so I generally come into contact with a child when there is some issue. And when I go back and actually look at how this issue could have, for example, been prevented, particularly when you look at teenagers or you look at children that are very overly sexualized. One of the main key reasons that these children share with me is, Nabila, no one talked to me about it, no one told me about it, and therefore they were then Googling and looking for things online. So one of the main reasons I would encourage children and parents of all families, particularly young kids, is we start the conversation from children are able to verbalize and talk. And even before then, we can name body parts for kids that are, for example, babies as you bath them, because that is how they learn. And one of the main things is we live in a world that is very promiscuous and very open. But if you have basically, you control the narrative for your kids and for your teens, you're not going to then end up with these really, really massive issues later on, because there is a clear understanding of what sex actually means in Islam and how we approach it, what are the do's, what are the don'ts, and how we can obviously experience our sexuality as human beings, which obviously is spoken about in many areas of Islam. But we need to obviously control the narrative. That is my main reason for why I encourage families to have these discussions.
I want to unpack what you just mentioned about, often the kids are saying nobody spoke to us about this. Let's talk about the ages of this conversation. What age do you recommend starting this conversation? And what are the signs, as you mentioned now, that some of the signs that a child will show that he or she is ready?
One of the main things when I talk about this particular topic, especially with families in the parenting work that I do and the therapy that I sort of do with kids, is I like to use almost like an onion narrative or metaphor. Is there's many layers. So the first thing parents need to do is that core middle layer of that onion, that is the tiny little bit. I would start that conversation as early as possible with regard to, for example, teaching kids under the age of 5 what is a safe touch, what is an unsafe touch, and naming their body parts with the correct biological and physiological terms. And I'll explain why I feel very passionate about that. So we live in a society where you get grown adults that are actually uncomfortable with using the words penis and vagina. Remember that we have sexualized those words, but they are the equivalent body part that I have, a vagina, which is the same as my elbow. I like to use that example. We never sexualize an elbow. So why would we sexualize a vagina, which is also part of my body? And I would then name the terms for very young kids with the correct terms, first of all. And I'll explain why in a bit. The second part is explain to children who can and cannot touch them and where can they be touched safely and where is an unsafe touch. My work involves seeing kids that have been touched inappropriately, but they don't know that it is inappropriate because no one cordoned off areas in their body to say it's okay for someone to blow your nose. It's okay for someone to wipe your mouth, but it's not okay for someone to touch you down there in your private parts. Unless, for example, you're at a school where you're getting washed or cleaned because mommy and daddy are not around, or you're unable to wash and clean yourself. So it's a very fine thing, but I would start these conversations early because, like the onion metaphor, you're going to build up layers. So it's many little conversations over the child's growth and development.
And often, like you said, parents are not comfortable even using these terminologies
Words.
Of private parts, these
Correct.
words, exactly. So how can parents initiate the conversation in a way that's both comfortable and engaging for the child? And does talking about sex with children have to be uncomfortable, or are there ways to make this conversation more natural? As you're saying, using the correct terminology in a way that you could still initiate the conversation, because often they will say private parts. So do you use private parts or the actual name of the organ?
So one of the main reasons why I hugely advocate for using the actual terminology of vagina and penis and not just private part is private parts are a very broad term, but also a child that is, for example, not touched in a safe way needs to recall or retell. And remember, that is in extreme form. It doesn't happen very often. But if a child is aware of what the term is, it makes it clearer for them or for you to explain to them that this is off bounds. No one is allowed to touch you in your penis area or vagina in an unsafe way unless it is for istinja or in the toilet when you are cleaning yourself. But there is no other touch that is appropriate at all, no matter who the person is. I find that when you use private parts, you then adding in lots of other layers, especially when you think of children's thighs or bums or backsides. Do you see there's it's a very gray area. So I prefer using the term and keeping it quite clear and clean, because in the recollection or retelling in an event, I find it very difficult when a child will use a term that I'm not even aware what they're referring to. They'll say, someone touched me by my nunus. Now, I don't know what nunus means. What was that? and remember, you can use dolls, you can use action figures, and you can explain, and you can even show the child on their body as a parent that this is this area and this is this area. Remember, the moment you make it known to a child, the imagination immediately stops. Okay. So the moment they're aware that girls have this kind of private part and boys have this kind of private part and it's different, and if you explain to them that early on, they're not curious. They're not going to look at pictures. They're not going to go online. They're not going to look at videos because you explain it to them.
That concept of stopping their curiosity, and often we want them to be curious about many things, but this specifically, as you said, be clear, be clean about it, and be specific. Often us as parents, our personal values and beliefs does come in. So how do we allow our personal values and beliefs influence our approach to discussing this topic, sex education with children, and how can we reconcile any differences that may come up?
So one of the very, very big things with sex education, particularly when parents control the narrative, and I like to use that word and I'll say it often, is when you control the narrative, you then add in, for example, parameters of when sex is allowed, how sex is allowed, what are the nikah stipulations, what is consent. Consent is something very, very important, obviously, even within a Muslim marriage. All kinds of these things. But these are topics that you can't suddenly talk to a 16-year-old about because you've never spoken to them when they were 2, 3, 4, and 5 to explain to them about their penis and vagina. It's then it becomes awkward. Then it becomes uncomfortable. But if you had spoken to them as a 2-year-old to explain, these are what girls have, these are what boys have, keep it age appropriate, and there is ways to keep it age appropriate, and you build on the conversation year by year as they develop. So you don't explain to a 2-year-old how babies are born because they don't have the intellectual capacity to understand, but you build on it bit by bit, almost like you're building a house from age 2 to about, I would say, basically by a 12-year-old. I would say a 12-year-old, 10-year-old, 12-year-old in today's time needs to understand it entirely, meaning they need to understand the sexual act, they need to understand how it happens, they need to understand the parameters, the beliefs, they need to understand when is sex allowed, what are our cultural beliefs, what are very important, our religious beliefs in terms of how Islam views sex and what are the parameters of when all of this is halal and allowed. And the moment you explain that to kids, and I sometimes have uncomfortable conversations myself because, I mean, these are my clients, they appreciate it. They're like, thank you for telling me. That's the end of it. They're not going to Google. They're not going to go onto YouTube. And I feel that it just cuts out a whole lot of unnecessary issues when children are very exposed through the internet.
Yeah, so very true what Nabila has said. Educational psychologists allow them to stop exploring the unnecessary when you've put a full stop to the question. So more on the birds and bees conversation just after this. Stay with us. Welcome back. A very good day to you. Assalamu alaikum. This is Life Matters Parenting Edition. As we're speaking to Nabila Gangat, a practicing and skilled educational psychologist based here in Johannesburg, who specializes in play therapy, supporting and identifying special needs of children and providing emotional support for children and adolescents. The very awkward conversation we're having is about how do you talk to your kids about the birds and the bees, sex education, and has she reiterated how important it is for us to use the correct language. And this does come from a professional because at the end of the day, she sits with these kids and having to explain to them, what private parts actually are and why you're calling it these names. Don't forget to interact with us. We love how you make the show. And if you know any family, friends or colleagues across the lands and over the beautiful seas, as I say, let them know that they can watch the show live, the awkward conversation of birds and bees talk with your children on hilaal.tv, www.hilaal.tv. And then you may also request any of our shows that we will upload on our YouTube channel via our WhatsApp line or our social pages. So welcome back, Nabila. Let's break down the age-appropriate examples. Can you provide some age-appropriate examples of how to explain sex education concepts to children from birth to teenagers?
So one of the big things was talking with, especially I would start at around 2 years old, where you as a parent bring up the concept. Some parents ask me at age 2, should I use the word sex? At this point, I would say no, you don't have to use the word sex. But remember, in the parent's mind, you know that you're building that little onion metaphor to build up all the layers over many years. I would explain about the differences in the bodies of a male and a female, and I would start there, especially with very little ones. If, for example, they have a sibling and there's a girl and a boy, it's a good example not to obviously encourage them to look at each other, because obviously in Islam we have to have haya and modesty, but I would explain that girls' bodies are different to boys' bodies and leave it at that. That is one kind of conversation that you have over a few months, I would say.
So as
a child is then growing up.
As you said, the one layer you're unraveling,
Correct. By the time a child is then, for example, getting a little bit older, they naturally become more curious and they might ask you. But remember, if you had brought up that bodies of males and females are different, and especially with very young kids, we are shy because we feel it's awkward. But little children, to be honest, are the least awkward human beings on earth. They'll ask you anything straight out with no shyness. So, for example, you can explain that women's bodies or girls' bodies and boys' bodies are different, and Allah made us this way because we each have a special purpose. I would always like to use that word. If you use the word purpose, they understand that a male's body is meant for something and a female's body is meant for something, and you're planting the seed. Because then later on, especially when we're coming to issues that I'm seeing a lot of, where there's a lot of gender identity issues and sexuality issues. Remember, you planted the seed early on that Allah made us male and female, and we each have a purpose on this earth. In my honest opinion, the rest of the gender spectrum in whole other issue is another conversation for another day. But basically, you almost encouraging your children to understand that this is the way of normal, which I don't like to use, but the normal way. And you obviously want them to follow into that kind of atypical path. As a child is getting, I would say, where they're interacting with other children, so school age, going to a nursery school, preschool, I would then very clearly and implicitly use the correct terms like penis, vagina, and for a little child, for especially a girl, you can talk about nipples because they don't have boobs yet or breasts yet, but you can actually use those terms, and you can say boys and men also have nipples, but theirs is different. And that's the purpose that we're talking about. The reason why I would use those implicit terms when they are in contact with other people out of your home and in school is you then need to build on a very, very important conversation about what is a safe touch and what is an unsafe touch, and where and how and who is allowed to touch you where. For me, I find there's a lot of children that are being abused and being sort of, I wouldn't even say, yes, abused because of the way that they are touched inappropriately. But these children are not even aware that this is a problem. And that obviously makes me really angry and really upset because these things could have been prevented. Children are very honest and children are very open generally. They're not natural liars. And if something happened in an incorrect way, they would then explain to you. But if you don't equip them with the language tools and examples of either explaining on their bodies or through a picture or even on a doll or a figure, that this is allowed, this is not allowed. Someone can, for example, like I said, blow your nose, which is perfectly okay, but no one can actually touch you on your bum or on your backside because there's no reason for someone to touch you there at all.
So with these explanations, there comes the questions. How should parents respond when their young child specifically, because now you're saying, women and men are different. So if they continue and ask the questions about sex, and you mentioned the different parts of your body, because often young children watch their moms breastfeeding as well. So now they're asking about, their mother's body, and they're caught off guard sometimes exploring their genitals. How should parents approach this?
So remember that if you have opened up the conversation early on, and this is where I call it a huge investment. If you invested early on in your child, explaining to them using the correct terms, and as we're building up to the different ages, by the time they get to age 8 or 9, and like I said, I would say age 10, you can't leave that conversation for too late. I would explain the sexual act to them with either a mother and a father both present. It's not necessary, but sometimes mothers need to have conversations, and then fathers, you can do it together separately, and you can do it with each child individually. So you don't have to combine children. And the reason why I would explain this is because otherwise they then Google what is sex. And if you were to take your phone right now and Google what is sex, you would be horrified what you find. So I don't want a child to go to Google and obviously fall into that hole of seeing things that are totally inappropriate, because even filters on phones these days don't prevent everything from coming through. You then explain the sexual act, but it's not going to be as awkward or as uncomfortable because you've already done all those inner layers of the onion, and now you're just building up the outer layers. And answer the questions honestly. So sometimes it's okay to say to a child, I'm actually feeling a little bit awkward right now. Can I get back to you? Or can we have this conversation? I just need to think about this. I will tell you. And I do think you need to be totally, totally honest, because think of what a child is going to see online versus what you are telling them. As uncomfortable as it is for you, I think in the world, in the age we live in, it is incredibly important to actually explain to them how sex happens, when is it allowed, what happens, how is a sperm and an egg obviously forming together to make a baby, how is a baby born, what are the various methods for how a baby is born. Explain to them openly, clearly, so they're not going to the videos and they're not going to online sort of media that you don't have the control of.
Yeah.
When I see kids, and this is where the issue comes in, and that's where I really became very passionate and open about talking about this, is they tell me, if someone had told me, I wouldn't have Googled the information that they found. And that is when, inshallah, we will have a further conversation about pornography and teen pornography addiction particularly. It all starts with a natural curiosity that no parent or adult figure in the child's life had answered a question that they actually requested or required an answer to.
Okay, so you have, really impacted us with trying to initiate the proper conversation and the proper terminologies. But often watching the show and parents hearing the word sex is very uncomfortable. So how does, proper education on sex impact a child's understanding and their possible potential relationships in the long run? Because I feel that parents and adults are uncomfortable because, yes, fine, we didn't talk about it back then when we were children. Our parents didn't do it with us. So, I was just talking to my cousin the other day, and just saying the word sex, it's hearing it rather on a show like this, it's very uncomfortable. So how does it potentially impact their relationships long term?
So one of the very, very nice things, and I will send you the article, is one of my colleagues on a WhatsApp group just recently did research about Muslim females in marriages and what was the impact of them not having sex education earlier on in life. So one of the juxtapositions that we find in the Muslim community and the difficulty is, we don't want to talk about sex, but one of the main issues when you look at marriages, not that I deal with a lot of couples, is they then have issues sexually. And females have issues in that wanting to express themselves, and males obviously are expecting a certain kind of thing or whatever. Think of that if you don't explain these things to children and suddenly you get married and then you're expected to obviously have sex. I mean, how does this even, psychologically, it already just messes with you in such a way that I feel that for the long-term health of our ummah and our community, it is something that we shouldn't be overly sexualizing in a way that you immediately, your brain goes into the gutter. I mean, your mind goes into the gutter. It should be something that is clean, that is pure, that is the Islamic parameters of what is allowed and how it is allowed. And there's so much khair, goodness, and beauty in Islam. I was watching a series the other day of sperm donors. I mean, in Islam, sperm donation, there's a very good reason why sperm donors are not allowed, because of the possible incest for future children, because that's obviously something that's not allowed. And I mean, I was horrified, and I was like, Islam is so beautiful because that is basically cut off in a way that is almost prohibited, because we're protecting our ummah and our nation and our progeny. And when you think about talking about sex to kids, I ask parents, what's the alternate? Would you prefer that Google educates them instead of us talking about it in an environment where your child can come to you and say, I saw this, or someone showed me this and it didn't look nice? And that's what kids still tell me and parents tell me, because they have the open door policy of, if you want to know something, ask me and I'm going to tell you.
Rightly said by educational psychologist Nabila, what is the alternative? So give them the better choice by you sitting down and talking to them about the birds and the bees and this often uncomfortable word sex. Inshallah, this show will help us understand and do it better. Please don't forget to interact with us as well, but more just after this short break. Welcome back. A very good day to you. Assalamu alaikum. We're talking about sex education and that awkward conversations with the little ones, the birds and bees conversation. We have Nabila Gangat, an experienced educational psychologist who is passionate about serving the Muslim community. She's currently battling with Sikh and at least the Muslim community who is currently, it's hard often to seek medical health services, and so she loves to, make that environment as comfortable as possible. Nabila also specializes in play therapy as well as parent support and counseling, trauma briefing, adolescent talk therapy, and navigating that awkward parent and teacher talks, as well as hosting workshops and training for parents and caregivers, as well as educations. But today we're focusing on this conversation that we want parents to hopefully help them through that talk when they do have it. So Nabila, let's get back to some of the common questions that children might ask. What are they, and how can parents address and navigate them effectively?
So some of the main questions I find, especially with kids or young kids, is they're very curious in terms of why do different people have different things? So they might ask you, and I think that's where you can talk about how Allah made each of us quite special and individual. The other one that commonly asked questions, particularly that I get from a lot of parents, is and that's usually when I am contacted, is parents find their kids or with their peers or friends playing doctor. Remember, children's natural curiosity is to want to explore, and I'll show you mine if you show me yours kind of thing happens very frequently and often. But I find it happens more often when parents have not shared and spoken about this in an earlier way with kids. It is actually pretty normal that children do want to see other body parts of, for example, a girl wants to see what a boy looks like and a boy wants to see what a girl looks like. It's something in Islam particularly that we shouldn't be encouraging, but, and this is where the but is, if parents have not now shared with children, of course that natural curiosity is not something that they're going to just sort of forget about or ignore. And this is where you have to now build that investment and build those inner layers of the onion to obviously start getting things moving in the right direction.
Okay, so
the biggest thing with, yeah, sure.
Sorry, no, continue.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead, Hawa. No, I was just going to start with another question, actually.
Yeah, because, that doctor, the game that the children do engage on, when the parent often discovers the playing doctor, and you don't often know how to respond in that aspect, and you, like you said, being comfortable with saying, okay, let's talk about this a little bit later. Don't do this, don't do that. And before the child even asks a question, or even if they don't, we're so afraid of saying, like, we don't know. And I want you to just reiterate that, sometimes it is okay for parents to say, let's wait for daddy, or let's wait for, big sister or your therapist to have this conversation, or whatever, avenue you do choose. And specifically that when parents aren't comfortable and the child is maybe seeing a therapist, can, within the industry, can you advise parents, would that be best to, latch onto the therapist to help them have this conversation?
So as therapists, yes, we sometimes, I have an open door policy with all the kids that I see, is that if they ask me a question, I try and be as genuine and as honest as possible, because obviously the relationship with the child is the foremost and most important. But I do have to take the lead in terms of what parents would like. So if, for example, I'm seeing a child, particularly because they have had a very early sexual encounter that maybe is not healthy or uncomfortable, I then need to ask the parent, are you comfortable with me sharing with your child if they ask, because that's part of the therapy process. Most important is I then do brief parents separately in that if kids have had an early sexual encounter that is not necessarily the most positive, which is really heartbreaking to see, but it happens, is the conversation needs to happen in full, whether you like it or not. Because otherwise this child feels like it's their fault, or they did something wrong, and they live with a lot of survivor guilt, and they have a lot of resentment and a lot of trauma. But if things are now clearly laid out in that these are the facts of the world, and this is exactly how the birds and the bees work, well, then that's it. So I feel that if parents open up the conversation, children also are very, very perceptive and they're very smart.
Yeah.
I like to use the example that we, for example, never really always talk about what our bank balances are, for example.
Yes.
We never just start a conversation and say, oh, I've got this much money in the bank. I mean, you get some random people, but generally it's not a conversation we have.
Yeah.
I like to put this kind of sex education in that same category of it's things we talk about at home, but we don't talk about it with everyone.
Yeah.
It's in that same category. So there's certain things that mothers and fathers will talk to their kids about, but those kids will never talk to other people about it because that is something that is taught and learned at home. The sex education topic is something that we don't talk about with our grandparents at an eat table, for example, because that is just not appropriate. And I think that is where the parent conversation that happens is slightly different to mine. My conversation in a therapy form is dealing with the kind of trauma or making sense of the actual event. And I generally see kids who have had a very negative sexual encounter early on, and I'm obviously trying to obviously rework that in a positive way as best as possible.
So we know that the influence outside is quite hard to compete with, and in some homes, I've heard, there's no screens or TVs at all. So to balance that act is quite hard as parents. I mean, I've had my dad say to us, the way you guys are raising your children is actually, we take our hats off because it's so much harder. We thought raising you guys were hard. So can parents effectively rather compete with the influence of media and peers in shaping their child's understanding of sex education?
So a parent that has started early on and built those inner layers of the onion in a very early, comfortable, genuine, non-awkward, real, truthful way, that parent has the up. I mean, obviously they have the upper hand later on in life, because when something pops up on social media, but you've already invested the time, the information, and knowledge with your child, the child is very unlikely to scroll further or click on the link. But if you have not had investment and the curiosity is just sky high, there's no conversations, there isn't an open door policy, there never really has been honesty, truthfulness, and genuine interaction around this topic from parents, the child is definitely going to click on the link. And if they click on the link, then that for me is where you are competing with a monster that cannot be taken back. That monster is done, it's free, it's loose. It's really, really, really difficult then to obviously rein it in, because one of my big issues with teens, particularly who do watch a lot of porn and see a lot of porn, is the entire premise of what sex is completely tilted and skewed and shifted. And remember, to try and normalize that is incredibly difficult.
Okay, that's quite scary, because there are parents that are sitting with that problem, and I've heard conversations of how the child has been exposed, and of course, at the end of the day, then they need to come and see someone like yourself, or take it a little further. But let's talk about having the conversation together as a family. So you maybe never approached this with your child at a younger age, and the kids are somewhere between 8, 12, and I'm just like maybe 16.
Yeah. So a variety of ages basically.
Yeah.
Correct.
Do you approach each child differently? Because you said certain language is for certain children, and when they start talking, please try and initiate, the correct terminology. So let's take us through that understanding. If a parent, has these ranges of children, should each child be approached separately? If the conversation hasn't been had yet, because now we know that the school is exposing them to it now as well.
Yes.
What is your answer to that scenario?
So I would like to, especially depending on your child's personality. So it's quite I'm going to contradict myself slightly, but I'm also going to answer in a way. Is remember, each child has a very unique personality, and every parent has a very different connection to a child. I would try and use that as a judgment in assessing whether the 8-year-old and 16-year-old, I mean, there is an 8-year difference here. Should they be in the same room when this conversation is being had? I would say my short answer is no. But if the 16-year-old and the 8-year-old are exposed to very similar things, or there isn't a real one fit answer, sort of fits all in a way, one size answer fits all. But I would try and keep the broader conversations to individual children and the more general conversations around morals, values, Islamic values, ethics, consent, safe touches, unsafe touches. Remember, even with older kids, you still need to remind them and have a conversation about what is appropriate and what isn't appropriate. I would keep the broader things more general amongst your kids, because remember, if all your kids hear the same message together, there is also a common understanding. And I think individual children will want to know individual things at different times. And I think that is where parents need to be fully aware, available, honest, truthful, perceptive in terms of how they answer these individual questions and bring up these conversations with each child, because every child is totally different.
On Life Matters today, we're privileged to speak to Nabila Gangat, educational psychologist, on the conversation, the awkward conversation of sex education. And we'll explore more in a series, hopefully, inshallah, and educate those, alhamdulillah, that hasn't had that conversation yet. But if your kids are a little bit older, we'll hopefully try and navigate that as well. So don't forget to interact with us. We have our WhatsApp line and our social media pages as well. After the short break, we ask Nabila, is it normal for young children to explore their genitals? Just after this, stay with us. Welcome back. In today's Life Matters, the birds and bees conversation, sex education. Lots of things I've learned today. I hope you have also had the opportunity to take some notes. And remember that if you know of anybody who needs to watch the show, please catch it on our YouTube channel, on our uploads. Life Matters, Hilaal TV Life Matters, and just look out for the Birds and Bees conversation with Nabila Gangat, who is a practicing and skilled educational psychologist based here in Johannesburg. She specializes in play therapy, supporting and identifying special needs in children and providing that emotional support for children and young adolescents. So, Nabila, often we miss the conversations around single parenthood. Are there any unique challenges for single parents when discussing sex education with their children?
So I find that a single mom or dad household, sometimes parents that I do come into contact with feel that they are at a disadvantage. I actually feel that one person talking to a child is actually an advantage, because you can control the narrative even more clearly. Because remember, when you're with a mom and a dad together, they each have their own history and their own background in terms of what their parents have shared or not shared with them. So I feel that a single mom or dad is actually at an advantage, because it's basically one person now controlling the narrative, which is really, really important. I also feel that sometimes single parents do take the job a little bit more seriously, because they just feel like they have extra weight on their shoulders. And to be honest, when I've met single moms or dads, they do a pretty amazing job. I really salute them and take my hat off to them. It's not easy to be a single mom or dad, but I do think that they actually at a huge advantage if you think about them controlling the narrative through a single person's lens, in a way.
Absolutely. I reiterate that. We don't, enough is not said to thank the single moms and dads for raising these kids, whether they are widowed or not, whether they are separated, just balancing, your issues, because often you have the issues between, the husband and the exes, and then the child traveling from one family to the other, for the one parent or both parents to, come to a playing field and agree on certain things for the better of the child. So let's acknowledge them as well. The awkward conversation or experience rather, when you find out your young child is exploring their genitals or private parts. How is this normal, firstly, and how should parents handle this curiosity?
So when a child is very, very young, I'm talking babies and toddlers, you'll notice that when you change nappies or they're going to the toilet or anything, they're quite happy to touch themselves in their private parts, and they explore and they want to feel and want to touch. that is exceptionally normal. And as adults, we sometimes over-sexualize that unnecessarily. Remember that a child needs to explore their bodies in order to understand what their bodies are made of and how their bodies are made up. And that is not a sexual act. So as adults, we need to take away our sexual innuendo or our sexuality that now we're placing on this sort of them touching themselves, which is not sexual at all. It is them just exploring their bodies, and it's perfectly okay when they're very young. I would, as a child gets older, not encourage them to do it in public, because obviously that's not appropriate. But the most interesting thing about very young children who often want to explore their genitals is if you ignore it or you don't place high emphasis on it being such a bad thing to do, children actually grow out of it and don't continue to do it in a very unhealthy way. Very rarely do you see 8, 9, 10-year-olds now touching themselves in public, because they've explored their bodies, they know what their bodies are like, and these are toddlers or babies that I'm referring to. And once that phase is over and their curiosity is sort of satisfied and they understand what their bodies are made of, they generally don't engage in that behavior going forward.
So I want to bring up again the discomfort of, talking about this conversation, and us as adults, do we need to understand why we're uncomfortable? Because it is challenging for some parents to talk to their children about sex and sex education. Is it important for us to understand why it is, firstly, challenging for us to do this? And how can we overcome this discomfort? Any ideas and tips?
So one of the biggest things with parenting generally, if I just were to use the very broad term, is when you parent a child, I like to refer to something in psychology we refer to as the ghosts of the nursery.
Okay.
I find that every time a child or a parent is parenting a child through a particular ethical, difficult area, remember your own personal view and your ghosts in your own nursery, depending on how your parents dealt with that issue at your age, immediately comes up. So one of the very, very important things for parents is please be aware of your blind spots in terms of where do you struggle and what do you struggle with. Because if you struggle with that, you probably are going to struggle with things that as almost culturally and through your own upbringing and childhood and your baggage is something that you will then struggle with. So the same stumbling blocks, it's almost like history repeating itself over and over again. And I find that's where parents need to know better and do better, because otherwise their generational sort of trauma or generational parenting style is sort of just passed on from one generation to the next without much thought. And lots of parents will say to me, but I turned out okay. So if I don't do X, Y, Z, then my children will be okay.
Yeah.
But the truth of the matter is we live in a different world. We live in a world where access to information and technology has changed our narrative and how we need to control the narrative as adults in these very, very young kids' lives. So to answer your question, I would definitely encourage parents to explore their issues, because their issues are what they are going to then pass on and project onto their kids in a way that I don't even think they're conscious about it.
I can almost sense, parents sending us this question with regards to not having the conversation, or they didn't have it yet, and the kids are maybe in primary school, or even high school, and they've probably been exposed to it by, a teacher or someone else. What are the solutions around that, Nabila?
So currently, as far as I must just double check, but as far as I know, the CAPS curriculum at, I think, grade 5 or 6 level, there's a full lesson and lessons in a textbook that I need to actually get my hands on and actually see. But I know there's a full lesson and I've had eyes on it, but I don't have actual copies here.
Okay.
If that's the first input your child has had, don't fear and feel like, oh my gosh, I'm like a really terrible parent now because I haven't had the conversation. Remember that with parenting, I like to use the example that I'm the eternal optimist and it's never too late. Okay. So I would now start the conversation regardless, because I would prefer that we add in very important, the Islamic aspect to what kids are now being exposed to at school level.
All right, we need to wrap up. Nabila, any final comments that you'd like to leave parents with on this awkward conversation of the birds and bees, and also let us know about the follow-up show, inshallah.
So I think just to end off and just to sort of summarize, I would say that as parents, I know that every parent out there is really trying to do the best they can. Yeah. I would say trust your gut to a point, but I also feel that we need to change with our world that is evolved and the access that we have to our phones and the internet, where I would prefer that parents are as open and as honest as possible in a very genuine and truthful way. And I think kids always appreciate it. Whenever I meet a kid or I see a child, and the moment I'm honest and genuine with them, they really appreciate my honesty and genuineness because it's something that they value. And as parents, if you can completely use that as the premise of the talk, I would really, really think you'd go a far way in maintaining that relationship in a positive way, inshallah. I think the follow-up talk that we could have is maybe dealing about teen pornography and its effects and sort of how we almost deal with that in terms of sort of why it happens, which we now sort of understand. It's based out of pure curiosity and maybe ways to deal with these sort of atypical or unhealthy behaviors that we see in young children where they have had sexual exposure in a very unhealthy way.
Thank you, Shukran, Nabila. Like I said in our previous interview on the Hajj show, we took a long time to have the show, and now is the perfect time to have it. Alhamdulillah, Allah decided that this is it. So really appreciate you affording us your valuable insights and sharing some practical advice on talking to kids about the often awkward conversation. I pray that our caregivers, parents, and community will hopefully implement where needed from what was expressed in today's show. Till we chat again in our follow-up episode on the effects of pornography on young minds. Be well and assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It was really good to be on your show again. Inshallah, I'll see you soon. Fi amanillah.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Only a pleasure having you, Nabila. Remember, it's essential to approach sex education with honesty, openness, and age-appropriate language we needed. By doing so, we can help our children develop a balanced understanding of the birds and the bees and the relationships around that. Don't be afraid to start the conversation early and be prepared to answer their questions as they grow. Let's take away the stigma and embarrassment, and let's create a supportive environment for all our children to thrive. Don't forget, awareness and education are key to prioritizing our health, mind, body, and soul. Thanks so much for tuning in. Let's continue the conversations of supporting each other in our journey towards growing our ummah and humanity that ultimately pleases our Creator. Until then, stay informed and stay healthy. From the rest of the Life Matters team here in the Johannesburg studio, wassalamu alaikum and goodbye for now.